Yeah. So we welcome today Paul Langan for our seminar. Paul studied in Edinburgh and Keele University and continued then to develop protein crystallography with neutrons mainly. And from 1994 to 1998, he worked at ILL as co-responsible of P19. And he went to the US, first to Los Alamos and then to Oak Ridge as a senior scientist and later becoming the associate lab director of the Neutron division. And so to conclude this extremely short biography in an unusual way, I will even extend it into the future because from October onwards, Paul will crown his career as a new ILL director. So you can start now already to place your bets how many mix-ups between institute name and director's name this will cause, and Patricia has to sort out later. Now, I will give the word to Paul, and any questions you have during the talk, please type them into the Q&A. And at the end, we will go through the Q&A to answer them in an orderly manner. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Uli. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me in this colloquium. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about what we've been doing at Oak Ridge in neutron sciences. I should say that, thank you for the kind words of introduction, Uli. As you can tell, I don't have a strong American accent, and that's because I was born in Scotland and I spent my first 30 years in Europe, where I studied, as Uli mentioned, at Edinburgh, and then at Keele University with Trevor Forsyth. And then I spent 4 years in France as a limited term scientist working with Sachs Mason as a co-responsible on D19. So I really look forward to coming back to Europe to work with you, to support you in continuing to do great science. I'm very excited about that opportunity. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Today, I'd like to talk about what I've been doing in Oak Ridge, where for the past 6 years, I've been the Associate Laboratory Director for Neutron Sciences. In that position, I've been responsible for leading the development and operation of our neutron sources at Oak Ridge. And we have 2 of them. One's an accelerator-based spallation neutron source, which we call the SNS, and the other's a reactor-based neutron source, the high flux isotope reactor, which we call Heifer. And we develop and operate the SNS and Heifer as user facilities, just like the ILL. And over the past few years, I think we've, in my opinion, we've been doing some great science, very impactful science. And also we're on the threshold of some exciting opportunities to upgrade our sources so that we can deliver new capabilities to do even more advanced science. So it's an exciting time at Oak Ridge for neutron sciences and neutron scattering. However, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I stepped down as Associate Laboratory Director for Neutron Sciences because I accepted the opportunity to come to the ILL to be the next director of the ILL. So I will be accepting the baton from Helmut, who I think has done a really excellent job over the past 4.5 years at the ILL. So that's a little bit about myself. As I say, so I'm here to talk about what we've been doing at Oak Ridge. And I recall that when I was at the ILL back in the 90s, I really didn't know much about Oak Ridge at all. So I'd like to start my presentation with a little bit of background or context for neutron scattering at Oak Ridge. So I'm going to share my screen now so that we can start the presentation. And hope you can all see this. So a little bit about Oak Ridge itself. The genesis or the start of Oak Ridge was a program back in 1943, which was associated with the Second World War, to demonstrate the production of plutonium from uranium in a fission reactor. So Oak Ridge really started off as a demonstration reactor. It was actually the world's first continuously operated nuclear reactor. It was essentially a pile of graphite bricks that were penetrated by tubes within which plugs of uranium could be inserted. So it was called the graphite reactor because it was essentially a pile of graphite bricks. And the reactor went critical in November 1943. It was co-located with a processing plant for separating plutonium from the spent uranium plugs. And it was highly successful in demonstrating production of plutonium from uranium. However, more interestingly, for me anyway, was the fact that a few months after the reactor went critical, a researcher called Ernest Wallen extracted a beam of neutrons from the face of the reactor to do neutron scattering experiments. So the first neutron scattering experiments at Oak Ridge were actually conducted in 1944. Of course, neutron scattering had been done before with fixed neutron sources, but the power of a reactor source really made a difference to the intensity of the neutron beam, and therefore the ability to collect quantitative diffraction information from materials. And Ernest Wallen was joined by Clifford Schull, and over the course of the next 10 years, Schull and Wallen looked at or determined the structure of about 100 compounds. So Oak Ridge really helped pioneer neutron scattering research at the graphite reactor in those early days. Although, of course, neutron scattering was being developed at several other sites in the world. And for that work in helping to pioneer elastic neutron scattering and determining the structure of all those compounds, Schull, together with a Canadian physicist called Brockhaus, were awarded the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, Wallen had died by then. So today at Oak Ridge, we continue to develop neutron scattering and pioneer the development of new types of sources. You see in this picture, this is the graphite reactor. It still exists. It was closed down. Its operations finished in 1963, and following the graphite reactor, Oak Ridge constructed and operated another 12 nuclear reactors for various missions, some of them for neutron scattering. And importantly for neutron scattering, the Oak Ridge Research Reactor, which was built in 1958, increased the power of the power from 1 megawatt at the graphite reactor to 30 megawatts at the ORRR. And that enhanced the type of neutron scattering science we did. In 1965, a high flux isotope reactor was constructed. It's still in operations, Heifer. Its initial mission was isotope production, particularly heavy actinides. It was built and co-located with an isotope separation plant, so we can produce isotopes and separate them from spent targets. It was also built with 4 neutron scattering beam tubes. So Heifer is a very productive neutron scattering source also. It was initially operated at 100 megawatts. We operate it today at 85 megawatts. We plan to take it back up to 100 megawatts later this decade after we've changed the pressure vessel. In 2006, we brought online the spallation neutron source, which is an accelerator-based neutron source that operates at 1.4 megawatts. we're in the process of doubling the power of the accelerator from 1.4 megawatts to almost 3 megawatts. We're halfway through that process. It will be complete round about 2024-25. And we're in the process of building a second target station at the SNS, along the lines of what was done at ISIS with Target Station 2. And to be honest, to a large extent inspired by what was done and demonstrated at ISIS. I should point out that we operate the SNS and Heifer now in order to provide researchers with cutting-edge neutron scattering capabilities to make new science discoveries and solve important research problems. Couple of observations. The graphite reactor was built in 8 months. The high flux isotope reactor was built in about 4 years. The SNS took a lot longer. It took 7 years to build, and the second target station, which has just gone into the design phase, that's projected to take about 13 years to build. So the length of time required to build these new, more complex sources is getting longer and longer. And I'm sure you've had the same experience in Europe with constructing new neutron sources in Europe. Another important point that I want to make is that Oak Ridge is one of 17 national labs that are operated on behalf of the Department of Energy, DOE. And at those 17 national labs, there are 24 different user facilities operated. Those user facilities include photon sources, the 2 neutron sources at Oak Ridge, several nanocenters, electron microscopy, mass spectrometry, and various other types of user facilities. And I very much promote the application or the use of joint user programs between our neutron sources, photon sources, mass spec nanocenters, electron microscopy centers. In my opinion, and I'm a strong believer in this, neutron data has its greatest impact often when it's combined with data produced using other techniques and probes, such as electrons and photons. So we have joint user programs with the Advanced Photon Source in Argonne, the NSLS-2 photon source in Brookhaven. We have a joint computational program with Berkeley, joint user programs in mass spec and microscopy with Pacific Northwestern National Lab. We have a joint program with our nanocenter at Oak Ridge, etc. So that's one of the benefits of being at a national lab in the United States, and the ability to work together across the network of national labs to provide users with easier access to multiple different types of orthogonal data. It's important to point out that the SNS and Heifer are highly complementary. Pulsed accelerator sources, of course, produce beams of neutrons that are pulsed and that are characterized by high neutron brightness. And those types of beams are often superior for many types of neutron scattering experiments or measurements, particularly those that involve studying phenomena across broad spatial and temporal regions, hierarchical structures that are materials that are hierarchical both in structure and energy. And the SNS is a powerful short pulse spallation source. As I mentioned, it's been upgraded towards 3 megawatts, and we're building a second target station that will be optimized for cold neutrons with very high peak brightness to deliver new types of experimental capabilities for emerging complex science. And steady state reactors such as Heifer, of course, produce continuous beams of steady state neutrons with high average brightness. And reactors have advantages for missions such as isotope production, materials irradiation, and selected aspects of neutron scattering, including neutron experiments that depend on studying phenomena at very specific length and timescales in parametric ways. And Heifer is a powerful steady-state neutron source, and as I mentioned, we're in the process of preparing to change the pressure vessel and to look at opportunities when we change the pressure vessel to enhance our experimental capabilities for neutron scattering, isotope production, and the opportunity to build a second guide hall. That's an important point. SNS and Heifer are highly complementary. And I want to make that point again in the next couple of slides. So because of that complementarity, the SNS has distinct advantages compared to Heifer for addressing certain types of science challenges with pulsed thermal neutrons. In particular, the inelastic instruments at SNS are really great for surveying large volumes of S of Q omega space to look for anomalies in dynamics and specific types of materials that have potential for applications. And the diffraction instruments at SNS are really powerful for looking at materials at atomic resolution rapidly. And our vibrational spectroscopy instruments are incredibly powerful for looking at atomic and molecular vibrations and librations and materials associated with the chemistry in those materials. And the vignettes below are just a handful of recent examples of those advantages in those specific areas, inelastic scattering, diffraction, and spectroscopy. And I'm not going to go into detail with those science examples. I just want to point out that the recent study on the left by Langan Atkins involved a group of researchers from Duke University who are looking at an inorganic perovskite, which has great potential as a photoconversion material. I think it's cesium, lead, and barium, and the group from Duke University used our inelastic instruments to survey phonon dispersion in these materials and to understand the origin of those unique conversion properties. I actually think it's 25% efficient in photoconversion, which is exceptional for photoconversion materials. And furthermore, this type of inorganic perovskite is really robust under extreme harsh environmental conditions, unlike unlike silicon-based materials, which are more susceptible to environmental conditions. Second from left, a group from San Diego University recently looked at a promising material for lithium battery anodes. In this case, it's a rock salt, lithium vanadium oxide. And unlike conventional lithium anodes such as graphite or lithium titanate, not only can it be rapidly charged, but it has high energy storage density as well. And users here used an engineering instrument to collect diffraction data to monitor, to locate what the distribution of lithium in this rock salt, and also is how it moves about and distributes as the anode charges and recharges. So that has great potential for developing faster charging and more reliable batteries, high energy density batteries. The next example, third from left, is another diffraction example with users from the University of Virginia, which involved using neutron crystallography to locate deuterium atoms that had been specifically, which were used to specifically replace hydrogen in a benzene cyclic cluster that's a precursor for synthesizing aromatic drugs. And that's exciting because it's a new approach to developing more effective drugs that have specifically deuterated hydrogens in order to improve their their strength of binding. And the last example is from a group from Manchester University in the UK, who are looking at the development of phlogisite zeolite with divalent nickel incorporated in order to separate alkynes and alkenes from cracked petroleum feedstocks, in order to remove the toxic alkynes that prevent the use of alkenes in cheap, ineffective plastic production. And I should mention that that was a collaboration with ISIS, the neutron diffraction data to locate the nickel and the ligands was conducted at ISIS. But the users came to the SNS in order to use our extraordinary capabilities for vibrational spectroscopy on our vision instrument. So these are just some examples. I want to make a couple of points. First of all, I want to re-emphasize the fact that all of these experiments would have been really difficult to have done at Heifer. They're best done at the SNS. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that all of those experiments involved using X-rays, microscopy, and a bunch of other experimental techniques in order to extract the fullest scientific information. And I think they're all exciting in terms of their potential for true translational impact on future technologies. So likewise, because of the complementarity between SNS and Heifer, Heifer has distinct advantages for doing certain types of science that's hard to do at the SNS. For example, with small angle neutron scattering, we can focus in on narrow regions of nanoscale structure, and that combined with deuteration and contrast variation allows us to provide unique types of information in biological systems and polymers. Inelastic neutron scattering at Heifer, where we focus in on narrow regions of Q omega, using triple axis techniques to do parametric studies of, lattice dynamics or magnetism, again, is a unique strength of Heifer, and also neutron imaging is a strength of Heifer. And the examples below, again, just illustrate experiments done at Heifer recently that would have been really difficult to have done at SNS. The one on the leftmost is an example from a group from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, who synthesized synthetic polymers that behave like ion channels and insert themselves in biological membranes and function as, not ion channels, proton pumps. And the cool thing about these synthetic polymers is they're not sequence specific. The individual monomers don't have to be added one by one. They're synthesized from 4 or 5 monomers in a way that produces heteropolymers that have an average hydrophilicity that can be controlled in a specific way. So they're not sequence specific, they're heteropolymers that have patches of high hydrophilicity or hydrophobicity. And this is really exciting in terms of potential applications in synthetic biology. The next example, second from left, is another SANS example, but this time looking at a topological material, specifically vortexes that are produced at high magnetic fields and low temperatures by a group from Notre Dame. And in this case, Morton, the lead scientist, collected data not only at Heifer, but also the ILL, I believe in collaboration with Charles Dewhurst and a bunch of other neutron sources. The third from left is another example from Duke University, where they are looking at the relationship between applied magnetic field and crystal structure in a rare mineral called trollite, with they hope to gain insights which allow them to develop new spintronic types of devices. And the last example on the far right is one which involved carrying out inoperando studies of a lithium battery as it's taken through its charge cycle using neutron imaging. And that was done by a group from the University of Virginia again. So again, to make the point that all of those examples, I think I find them really exciting in terms of their potential for translational impact. And again, most of them would have been really difficult to have done at the SNS. They're well matched for reactor neutron sources. So I think, in general, our user program has been producing great science, and the science we're doing, in my opinion, is very impactful, and the impact of that science is enhanced or leveraged by the fact that our users are encouraged and enabled to gain access to multiple types of different user facilities to apply electrons, photons, and neutrons to solve their challenges. However, I have to say that in addition to the user science over the past year, we've been very much focusing our resources on doing what we can to help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So, since the pandemic started, we did not falter in maintaining and operating our neutron sources, because we saw that they could play a critical role in helping to fight the pandemic. The first couple of months after the pandemic, we operated the SNS and Heifer only for COVID-19 research. We actually have 30 beam lines between the SNS and Heifer in our user program, and we operated about 10 of those beam lines in support of COVID-19 research. And then in June, July, we started to restart our general user program through a remote access mechanism. We don't allow users on site, but users can send samples and then conduct their experiments in collaboration with our scientific staff, or through actually remotely manipulating the instruments now. We have a pilot project where 4 instruments are equipped so that users can operate those instruments remotely from their own labs. And now we're actually operating a full general user program across all of our instruments. But as I say, at the start, we really focused our resources on helping to fight the pandemic together with the other national labs. In fact, DOE gathered the national labs together to form a national virtual biotechnology lab, and we worked together to exchange information on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, exchange plasmids, exchange protocols, carry out experiments together, and we really made a lot of progress. In particular, our staff were involved in, on the left here, were involved in carrying out computational in silico drug screening studies using our high-performance computers at Oak Ridge. We actually have really powerful supercomputers at Oak Ridge that are ideally matched with our neutron scattering capabilities. We also collected elastic neutron scattering on various potential drugs that could be therapeutics for people infected by COVID-19. To better understand the dynamics of the different chemical groups in those drugs. Of course, free energy or entropy is a crucial ingredient in strong ligand binding to drug targets in the virus. And I know that Mark Johnston will be excited to see this rotating methyl group here in this particular drug. And, in addition to better understanding the free energy and entropy of the drugs, the information we got from our inelastic scattering instruments at the SNS can also be used to improve the force fields that are used in molecular dynamic studies that are facilitated by our supercomputers to do in silico drug screening. We also carried out a very strong program in SANS studies of the non-structural proteins produced by the COVID-19 virus that self-assemble into complexes to replicate the components of the virus. We carried out reflectometry studies of the interaction of membranes with the viral spike protein, various drugs, also the envelope protein from the virus. And we also looked at fusion events in host viral interactions. And lastly, we've had a strong program in applying diffraction, neutron crystallography, to assist in rational drug design. In other words, to provide information for structural assisted drug design. So I'm very proud of the way that our staff stepped up to work together to fight against the pandemic. And it wasn't only our structural biology staff. There were hardcore condensed matter physicists who got involved in the inelastic studies. We all stepped up to do what we could to help with the effort to try to find a solution to the pandemic. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I do want to go into a little bit of detail with that last example, because I think some of the results that have come from our crystallographic studies of the different components of COVID-19 are starting to come to fruition, and we're producing some really exciting results. So a little bit of detail. The SARS-CoV-2 virus replicates after it's invaded us by expressing two long polypeptides. These two long polypeptides have to be cut into smaller pieces or non-structural proteins by a molecule that's called an enzyme, or the main protease enzyme. So that main protease enzyme, which I've labeled as MPRO, is essential for viral replication and for the continued spread and infection of the virus. And if we can stop that enzyme from doing its catalytic job of cutting those polypeptide chains, then we can help cure infected patients and stop the propagation of COVID-19. So our approach was to, first of all, to develop a 3D model of the main protease, which we could use in rational drug design. So in our first step, we worked with collaborators at other national labs to express the protein and grow crystals and determine an X-ray structure which showed us what the skeleton or the shape of this enzyme is, and so that we could start thinking about designing drugs that fit into that shape and can block the catalytic site. And the first surprise we got is our room temperature X-ray structure was significantly different from all of the other cryogenic structures that were being determined at other national labs. And that's important because accurate structures for drug design is really important. So we produced a structure that was different and we believe more accurate. And we passed that on to our colleagues who were doing in silico drug screening studies. Our colleagues at Oak Ridge National Lab who were using our supercomputer, and also later our colleagues at Argonne National Lab who were also doing in silico drug screening. And they've come up with hits, interesting hits. And some of those drug hits have we've screened using in vitro binding studies, and we've actually come up with drugs, potential drugs that were carrying out neutron scattering, neutron diffraction studies on now, and we're excited about the possibility of these drugs being effective. Anyway, and the next step after determining the X-ray structure was to complete the 3D model by using neutrons to find the hydrogen atoms. So although X-rays are a really powerful technique for determining the skeleton or the framework of a protein, they're less good at visualizing hydrogen atoms because hydrogen atoms are so small, they only have one electron, they scatter X-rays weakly. In fact, protons are completely invisible to X-rays. So neutrons are a powerful additional technique for looking deeper into the structure of enzymes to locate the protons and hydrogen atoms and to understand the chemistry that's happening in biology. So we collected a neutron structure of this protease. We saw the protonation in the active site. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. This neutron structure provided us with really interesting information for drug design. But I want to point out that our neutron study also revealed the protonation or charge state of the two catalytic residues that are involved in the catalysis of this enzyme. And we were surprised to find that the enzyme had a protonation state and charge distribution that's ready for rapid catalysis. So in this study, the fact that we have a catalytic site with an unusual sphitter-ionic arrangement was new information, and it means that this enzyme is really primed to rapidly cut those polypeptide chains. So having established the 3D model, we then turned towards drug design. First of all, as shown on the left, we determined a number of X-ray structures of known drugs. And the big surprise there was that we found that the active site, the binding site where we want the drug to bind, is incredibly malleable or flexible. The drugs can actually push their way in to the site, and depending on how big or how small the drug is, the binding site reacts in a different way. So that was a bit of a surprise. These drugs can push their way into the active site, rather than the more traditional, key lock image of drug binding in traditional structural biology. This is different. This is a flexible binding site. And we actually got a couple of promising candidate drugs. So the drugs that we mostly looked at are known hepatitis C drugs, and a couple of them are interesting as candidates for further development and transformation into drugs that are more specific for the protease. On the right side, we took one of those drugs and we looked at the neutron structure. So in this right-hand vignette, this is the active site, and this is the protonation and charge state of important side chains in the active site. This is the catalytic pair, the sphitter-ionic pair, histidine and cysteine. And on this side, this is the active site after one of those drugs, teriparatide, has bound to the active site. And it covalently binds to one of the catalytic residues, the cysteine. And the really surprising thing here is that as the drug binds, not only does it push its way into the binding site, but it changes the electrostatic pattern, or it manipulates the protonation state of enzyme residues in the active site to enhance its binding. And that's something that we didn't expect. And it's something that immediately suggested that this phenomena, a drug or a small molecule that can go into an active site and rearrange the charge pattern is a kind of new way of thinking about how we can approach drug design. So at the moment, we are taking this insight and we're using it to design new drugs that can go into the active site and actually manipulate the charge environment. And we call them charge-changing drugs, so that they can specifically interact with the SARS-CoV-2 main protease. So that I think we've, in a relatively short period of time, over the course of a year, I think we've made quite a bit of progress towards actually having a translational impact with our neutron studies and this new approach to charge-changing drugs, and also with our, massive high-performance computing in silico drug screening trials. I see here that, Teleprevir is a promising drug for repurposing, and that's maybe that's a strong statement. It's a drug, but I don't think Teleprevir will be a drug that we repurpose. I think it's more the insights that you can develop drugs that can charge change the active site that is the more significant result. Good. So I think we've made great progress, but I want to make the important point that we don't only do neutron scattering at Heifer and the SNS. At Heifer, Heifer's essential for the US because of its role in isotope production. There are a number of isotopes produced at Heifer that are really difficult to produce elsewhere in the world. In particular, Californium-252 depends on the really high peak flux of thermal neutrons right at the center of the Heifer core. And I want to point out that plutonium-238 produced at Heifer is being used to power and drive the Mars Explorer that's on the surface of Mars just now. And I really hope that the Explorer discovers something important so that we can say that Heifer contributed to an important discovery on the surface of Mars. But we also do, neutrino physics. Of course, Heifer has a very clean neutrino spectrum from fission of uranium-235. And the SNS has a different kind of neutrino spectrum that's less clean, but it's pulsed. And so we can do different types of neutrino science at the SNS and Heifer, neutron electric dipole moment measurements, of course, materials irradiation, activation analysis, gamma radiation. And we're building a stronger and stronger program in accelerator physics at the SNS, with the view of expanding the use of the SNS beyond just neutron scattering into other areas of accelerator-driven research, such as muons, that type of thing, USR. SNS and Heifer, I think, are productive, and as I say, I want to emphasize their complementary capabilities. On the left, this chart of publications, I just want to show you that a large number of publications come from non-neutron scattering use of the SNS and Heifer. And on the right, that shows the distribution of publications that come from Heifer, the SNS, and that are the result of using both Heifer and the SNS. And you can see that perhaps only 10% of our publications come from using Heifer and the SNS. So the SNS and Heifer are really distinct and complementary. The other thing I want to point out is that the SNS, about 5 instruments contribute to 50% of publications. So we have 19 instruments in our neutron scattering program at the SNS. And the instruments that mainly contribute to publications are 3 diffraction instruments, one of our inelastic instruments and a quasi-elastic instrument. Whereas at Heifer, it's a different set of instruments that contributes to 50% of our publications, our small angle scattering instruments, a diffraction instrument, and a triple axis instrument. So you can see that different types of instruments are more productive and more impactful at different types of sources. You'll see that the number of publications dips or flattens out or plateaus after 2018. I looked into this. This is the number, on the left is the number of experiments we complete each year at the SNS and Heifer. And you can see that in 2018, we actually had a planned shutdown of SNS in order to replace the inner reflector plug. Then the inner reflector plug is a massive 30-ton piece of iron and beryllium that reflects neutrons back in towards the target at the SNS and the modulators. So it's a bit like a reflector in a reactor. That has to be replaced every 5 years. So the SNS was shut down for 6 months. That impacted the number of experiments we could do. And then in 2019, Heifer was shut down for a whole year because of an issue we had with a failed fuel element in the reactor. And of course, in 2020, our general user program was heavily impacted by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Although we kept our neutron sources operating throughout the pandemic, our general user program was very restricted and remains restricted at the moment. And when I look at the number of publications that's come from our neutron scattering experiments, I can't fail to notice a similar pattern that lags the number of experiments completed each year. And it suggests that there's a 2 or 3 year lag between instrument publication and completing experiments. And an important thing to point out is, and something that I'm very proud of actually, is that at the moment, 39% of our peer-reviewed instrument publications appear in journals with an impact factor greater than 7. And so, you know, although the number of publications, the volume of publications may have plateaued, certainly the impact of our publications continues to increase. Just want to briefly make the point that there are opportunities to go further. We are halfway through our Proton upgrade of our accelerator complex to increase the power from 1.4 megawatts to 2.8 megawatts. We're building a second target station with new capabilities for science that depends on cold neutrons with high peak brightness and broad energy ranges. We're building more instruments, and we're getting ready. We're looking towards changing the pressure vessel at Heifer and enhancing neutron scattering capabilities. We're working with the community to explore the possibility of a MUSR source and also a single event upset source. And we're very intentional of exploring the opportunities to federate our instruments with our high performance computing capabilities so that we're on the edge of these amazing computing capabilities, and we can easily share data that can be used for AI machine learning applications. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go through the remainder slides very quickly. The second target station in particular will deliver wholly new types of scientific capabilities, which will be important for science that depends on very small samples, or science that depends on characterizing samples across large spans of hierarchy, or which involves time, which requires time resolve studies of kinetic processes. I want to quickly re-emphasize the fact that SNS and Heifer are different. They're best matched to different types of measurements, and second target station is not an exception. Second target station will also offer new capabilities in a different area of energy, resolution, and bandwidth. And our approach is to best position different types of instruments at those three different sources so that we can maximize the overall science capabilities across Heifer, first target station and second target station. And that's really our roadmap for the future. Our vision is to have three neutron sources that are very different in terms of the type of measurements that they're best optimized for, and that together provide the broadest access to world-leading neutron scattering capabilities. And that's all. I wanted to finish, a little bit early to leave some time for questions. And, I'm happy to go back and talk in more detail on any of these issues.
So thanks a lot for this very nice overview. And I see that we already have some first questions. So the first one was from Alan Newart, who you mentioned the new target vessel, which I understand is to go to 100 megawatts. But you also mentioned the installation of a cold source. Are there also plans to go towards more thermal neutron beams?
Yes. So actually, I should say that, I said that back in 2019, Heifer was shut down for a year because of a problem that we had with a fuel element. That was terrible news for neutron scattering, but it was good news for us because it highlighted the crucial role that Heifer plays for many missions of national importance, including isotope production. And it became clear to our sponsor, DOE, that we have to keep Heifer going. And they have agreed that there's a mission need to change the pressure vessel. And as we're changing the pressure vessel, it makes absolute sense for us to look at other things that we should be doing, such as considering different reflector geometries or additional guide holes, etc. So we're actually going to change our permanent beryllium reflector in 2025. We have a solid reflector. It's not like the ILL where you have a tank of heavy water. Our reflector is a solid piece of beryllium. We'll change that in 25. And when we do that, we'll also refurbish and change our cold source, our existing cold source, to increase its brightness. And we'll change our beam tubes. We'll optimize the existing cold guide hole. But when we have the opportunity to change our pressure vessel, there'll also be an opportunity to add a second thermal guide hole. And that's exciting for us because our thermal instruments at the moment are all inside the reactor building, very close to the reactor face. So they suffer from high background levels, and building a thermal guide hole at Heifer would actually allow us to increase our signal to background for thermal neutron measurements by a factor of 10 at least. And that coupled with, other advances in neutron scattering technologies and techniques, I think will have a big impact with what we can do at Heifer in the future. So I want to emphasize the fact, though, that Heifer was built for isotope production. It only has 4 beam tubes, and the beam tubes are quite small. We'll never have more than 20 instruments. But what we can do is make those instruments as cutting edge as possible, so that we can enhance the uniqueness of Heifer compared to the SNS and do the best overall science. But we're never going to compete with the ILL in terms of the number of instruments or scientific productivity, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you. Then Bill is asking if you see any potential showstoppers or major hurdles for the second target project of SNS or for the Heifer upgrade.
I don't see any major road stoppers for the second target station. A precursor for that project is increasing the power of our accelerator. We call it the Proton Power Upgrade Project. And we're almost halfway through that project. It just involves adding more cryo modules to the accelerator. We've got all of the, I think we've gotten, 90% of the funds to complete that. It's $270 million. Everything's going very well. We'll start ramping up in power as early as 2023, to 1.7 megawatts. We expect by late 24, early 25 to be ramping up to full power, the new power level at the SNS. Second target station, we were sent about $50 million this year to move us along. We're staffing up. We have about 100 staff associated with the project just now. Second target station doesn't have any serious accelerator component to it. It's largely concrete and instruments and a tungsten target, similar to the one that's been developed for the ESS. So from a technical point of view, I think, and this is an oversimplification, of course, but from a technical point of view, I don't see any major showstoppers, and I don't see any major fiscal problems at the moment, or political problems at the moment.
I have a quick question concerning this MUSR. So this will be a transmission. Yes. This would be a transmission target like PSI is doing it, or you would have a separate target station where you deflect from time to time?
Separate target station. So, I said that we're making progress with our accelerator physics research. When we started to build the SNS, we had very little expertise in accelerator physics, but over the years we've built that up, and we've been working with the Japanese to look at something called laser stripping. So taking the electrons out of the hydride pulses before they go into the accumulator or injection ring, accumulator ring. And that laser stripping can be used to knock out a fraction of the proton beam, which can then be diverted to another target. So we'll use laser stripping to knock, a fraction of 1% of our beam and divert it to a third target station. And at that third target station, we'll have USR capabilities and also a capability for bombarding electronic components with neutrons to help with, aviation, aviation industry with our electronics. And that's a project that's driven by the user community. So there's a small group in the US and Canada that are big proponents of building a USR source in the US, because we don't have one, and we don't have what you have in Europe and what exists in Asia. So it's a big need in the US to establish that type of capability, like the one at ISIS or PSI or GPark.
Yeah. There's a short question of Eddie, because you mentioned the updates on thermal and cold neutrons. Did you also evaluate the need for hot neutrons, and what is the outcome?
We haven't evaluated the need for hot neutrons. We have thermal modulators at the SNS, and we have useful neutrons down to perhaps half an angstrom, but we haven't really explored the use of neutrons below half an angstrom, except for some types of fundamental physics experiments.
Okay. And what has been the role of support laboratories in enabling life science experiments?
Well, it's been huge. It's been massive, especially over the past year. We have a Center for Structural Molecular Biology, which is fully equipped to do cloning, or to move plasmids between all types of different eukaryote and proeukaryote hosts, and we offer that as a user service. It's a little bit like the PSB in Grenoble, although PSB I think is even better than what we provide at the SNS and Heifer. However, we do have the advantage of being part of a larger national lab network, and during the pandemic we've been moving about plasmids and using the protein production facility at Argonne, using the Joint Genome Institute, we're really part of a really large collaborative network that allows us to quickly move from, specific biological target to express protein and sample in a very quick way. In fact, the first structure of the main protease, we were doing neutron studies of the main protease within about 3 months of having the idea. And that's very quick for, although the X-ray samples were perhaps 300 microns in size, the neutron samples were 1,000 times bigger. And to go from an idea to a neutron scattering experiment in structural biology is a challenge. And we did it quickly by working with our collaborators at other national labs.
Okay, so Mark has raised the hand.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. The quality of the publication output from your 2 neutron sources looks excellent, is excellent. But one question we've had in Europe is to what extent neutrons give added value to publications, i.e., is this fraction of high impact publications, is it higher than for other techniques, or how does it compare with other techniques? Is that an analysis you've done or you're aware of? Or
it's not analysis. I've not been intentional about doing that analysis. But it would be straightforward to compare the number of publications from light sources that have an impact factor greater than 7 and benchmarking that way. I know what the answer would be, but I'm not that interested in doing it. The examples I showed are of scientific results that would not have been possible without the use of neutrons. So, for example, I could go through each example, and unfortunately, I didn't take the time to articulate why neutrons provided unique information that was necessary to deliver on the scientific result. Does that indirectly answer your question?
I think that's I think that's the smart way to look at things. I mean, these bibliometric measures, they have their pitfalls, of course, but other people are doing them, and in Europe, people have looked at this, and for the neutron and X-ray sources, and look to see whether using neutrons or using X-rays gives effectively higher impact publications. It's normalized the field, so okay. But no, I think you've given a good answer. So
my main focus over the years as ALD here has been on improving the impact or importance of the science we do, regardless of what happens elsewhere. But I do see an important part of improving the impact of the science that we do here as bringing to bear as many different types of data as possible to the scientific problem. So that means working with light sources and other facilities. I think that's the right way to put it.
Thanks.
Who was first, Helmut or Patrick?
I don't know. I can go ahead. So thank you, Paul, for that nice talk. Concerning the upgrade of the power, I remember discussions where not so long ago people would have said if you reach 1.4 reliably, you reach the limit of what targets of that kind can sustain, and that was also a little bit the reason why the long pulse sources where you spread the peak power over a longer period was so exciting. So what was the technical breakthrough so that now you are confident that you will be able to operate a short pulse source at 3 megawatts? Is there
there was a technical breakthrough, and our targets consist of stainless steel containers within which we circulate liquid mercury. And the mercury, when a proton pulse impacts the stainless steel container, it pushes back the mercury, and the mercury slaps back, and that causes erosion or cavitation in a very simplistic way. And the technical breakthrough was the insight that if you inject small helium bubbles into the mercury, you can mitigate that cavitation erosion. And this is something that we didn't develop. It's something that we worked with our Japanese colleagues at JPARC to develop. And we've really benefited from collaborating with JPARC to fully deploy this technology. So our targets, we operate 2 targets a year now. We used to operate 3 targets a year. And when we take our targets out of service and when we cut holes in the front piece of the target and look inside, there's minimal cavitation erosion damage at 1.4 megawatts. Whereas when we were operating at 850 kilowatts without this technique, our targets were being eaten up within weeks. So this is really it's made a huge difference, and we're confident, more than confident, because of the tests we've done for PPU targets, that we'll be able to operate at 2 megawatts and beyond with this gas injection technology.
Excellent. Thank you.
And our Japanese colleagues are seeing the same results with gas injection there.
Yeah.
Okay, so Patrick?
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation. Are there any activity on ultra-cold neutrons? And if yes, what kind of experiments are being done?
We have no activities with ultra-cold neutrons at the moment, but the fundamental physics community are very excited about the possibility of a cold neutron source at the second target station. And I know that they are working with the second target station project to make sure that there will be a ultra-cold neutron source included in the STS design.
Okay, in one of your slides, you mentioned some work on neutral electric dipole moment. Neutron electric.
Yes.
So that's this.
That's happening at the SNS. It's led by someone called Jeff Green, who did a similar experiment at Los Alamos when I was at Los Alamos, and you, Jeff. And he will also do a similar experiment at the second target station when the second target station is built, unless he gets a result before then.
Thank you.
I think that this experiment has its own built-in ultra-cold neutron source, but you don't have a user-accessible ultra-cold neutrons as we have allowed.
Yeah.
Yes. There was a question by you had another one, Patrick, or no? What is by Michael? What is the ratio of operational investment costs to manpower for the 2 neutron sources? Because one is an old one and one is a new one, which costs a lot of electricity.
Yeah. Well, we have 700 staff across the 2 neutron sources. Our annual budget to operate the neutron sources is $280 million. So if you convert that to euros, I have no idea what that is. It's probably 220 million euros. But going back to dollars, about 180 million supports operation of the SNS, and about 100 million supports operation of Heifer. I should say that, as I said, Heifer has many missions in addition to neutron scattering. So that 100 million supports isotope production, materials irradiation, gamma activation, etc., etc. In addition to those funds, we now receive about 50 million a year to build the second target station, and we last year we received about 50 million as a kind of final payment to finish off construction of the Proton power upgrade. And the pressure vessel replacement at Heifer, we expect that to be delayed towards the end of the decade, or at least the second half of the decade, just because of the huge resources that are being sent to Oak Ridge by DOE at the moment. It's hard, we can't do everything. Resources are limited. Although we're very grateful for the resources that we do get, from US taxpayers.
Then we have a technical question by Robin, because you put as a highlight of the Heifer the imaging. Now, what's
Yes.
the role or future role of Prof imaging at SNS?
Well, we're actually building an imaging station just now at the SNS, which will be called Venus. And so this will allow us to do 3D energy resolved imaging of mainly engineered components or additively manufactured components, or things in operando. It's mainly for engineering purposes, although it could be used for biology and other types of applications. So this is hyperspectral 3D imaging using time-of-flight neutrons, where we not only see strain stress, we not only see the 3D image, but we also have voxels that represent strain stress and also elemental analysis, that type of thing. And that instrument, it's 2 years into construction, and we expect it will be complete around about 2024. We're really excited about it because it's the first of its kind in the US, that type of 3D energy resolved hyperspectral imaging technique.
Okay. Then I have a question about your foreign user community. So how
Yes.
much foreign users you have, and how does this evolve over time? Did you see an impact of the NRU closure in Canada or of the current closures in Europe? Did this increase the number of proposals of foreign users?
Not really. We haven't seen a dramatic increase in foreign users. We do have a large number of foreign users. I would say at least 16% of our users are from outside of the US, in particular Canada, China, Germany, UK, and France. And we have many users from those countries. When I look at our publications, about 30% of our publications involve co-authors from outside of the US. And we actually have a large number of co-authorship with ILL scientists and scientists from ISIS and photon sources. But I think that largely reflects the fact that users use data from multiple sources in publication rather than actual scientific collaboration between those facilities. So does that answer your question? I would say it's about 16%. It's pretty steady. It's largely those 5 or 6 countries that I mentioned. And about 30% of our publications involve collaborations with European and Asian research facilities.
Okay, thank you.
And I should also mention that we do not consider nationality when we allocate beam time. We have a peer review system that selects the best science irrespective of nationality.
And we hope to get this one day. So then there's a question by Alan Ewart. You explained the importance of the Heifer for radioisotope production. And so he proposes to make ILL a world-beating isotope production facility.
Well, that's a really good observation. And the fuel element at Heifer looks almost identical to the fuel element we use at, the fuel element at ILL is almost identical to the fuel element at Heifer. The only difference is in the middle of your fuel element, you have a control rod. We don't, we have an open space, which is a flux trap into which we put, targets for heavy actinide production. So there need to be some slight modification to ILL to do all of the isotopes.
Actually, we have already irradiation tubes which we are using. It was just not in the original concept of ILL, but we are using it since 10 years or so.
But I think you could, at the ILL, I think you could easily position targets around the fuel element, connected by tubes or rabbits, so that you could take targets in and out, to do isotopes such as Pu-238, actinium-227. some really important isotopes I think could be produced at ILL. But I want to emphasize an important fact. We have Heifer, but we also have a separations facility next to Heifer. And when we were thinking about should we replace the pressure vessel at Heifer, or should we build a new reactor? To replace Heifer would cost about $3 billion today. To replace the isotope separation facility would cost about $3 billion today. That's $6 billion to replace the isotope production capability that Heifer provides the US just now. So you have to think about separations as well as, irradiating targets to produce heavy actinides. And, if you don't have to do that at the ILL, if you can transport those targets, if they're long-living, stable isotopes, I think you should look into it.
Okay. Then we have a question by Eddie. In which proportions polarized beams are used at SNS and Heifer, respectively?
There are advantages in doing polarized neutron measurements at Heifer. That's clear. We do, and we have polarized single crystal diffraction at Heifer, and we have polarization and analysis capabilities on one of our SANS instruments at Heifer. So it is clear that polarized neutrons at the moment are largely based on Heifer. That might change when the second target station comes along. It might be easier to do things with cold spallation neutron sources than the predominant thermal beams that we have at first target station at the moment. We do have a polarized triple axis spectrometer at SNS called HiSpec, but in general, our polarized measurements are done at Heifer.
Okay, I have a question because I saw that some of your very productive instruments, they have 3 instrument responsibles plus a so-called scientific associate. So is this productivity the hen or the egg? So do you see a direct impact of correlation with staffing?
Well, I haven't carried out that experiment of changing that parameter to see what happens. But there are instruments that have 3 instrument scientists, and there are instruments that have 1 instrument scientist, because the throughput of instruments varies greatly. For example, on our Paugen and Nomad or diffractometers at the SNS, they produce about 50-60 papers a year, and they're heavily staffed. And although they have automatic sample changers and robotics and stuff like that, it's a labor-intensive business. And where there are other instruments that require 1 or 2 staff, because measurement times are so long. But my personal opinion is that it's essential that beamlines have sufficient scientific staff to ensure that staff have time not only to support users doing experiments, but to engage in meaningful scientific and technical collaborations. I think the role of instrument scientists in doing the best science and bringing the best scientists to our facilities shouldn't be underestimated, and that requires sufficient staffing levels. And and I see the impact of well, to put it another way, when I look at JPark and the outstanding neutron scattering capabilities and innovative technologies they've developed there, I think they could be even more impactful if they had more staff on their instruments at JPark. That's just an example that immediately comes to mind.
And now if you get more and more mail-in users who respond to COVID, or because it becomes a trend, this will probably also affect the staff requirements.
Yeah, but I think the number of experiments that can be done remotely, I think mail-in and remote automatic experiments are important, but I don't think it will ever represent more than 20 or 30% of our user program. It's important and it's critical, but the large fraction of our experiments require scientific engagement, and some of them require scientific presence. Remote automated instruments, I think, are something that we have to pay attention to and push forward with, because it's going to happen and we have to be part of making it happen. But I think there will always be a large fraction of experiments that require scientists to be engaged.
Okay, so thank you. I don't see any other questions. Everybody who has additional questions has to wait now till October, where he can ask them face-to-face, hopefully in a mask-free environment in our reopened cafeteria. So we thank you again for this great talk and nice discussion, and hope to see you in October.
Uli, I'd just like to say as a last word, if anyone does have specific follow-up questions, you're more than welcome to email me. Because I've stepped down as director here, so I have a lot of spare time all of a sudden.
That's good.
Okay.
Thank you, Uli. Thank you all. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Take care, everybody.